The legacy news media, the mainstream news media, is getting it wrong again. We've had so many moments in the past couple decades when my colleagues, me, have had cause to really analyze and interrogate our methods as journalists. There was the Iraq War and the lies that we were told about WMDs. There was Trump's election and how the journalists got that so wrong. And the amplification of fringe and extremist candidates in politics that has happened so often over the past, say, 20, 25 years. The news media has in some cases not just helped fringe candidates, but actually played a big role in getting them elected to office. I'm not blaming this all on journalists. Journalists, by and large, are underpaid, overworked, and are devoted to the idea that they are making the world a better place through free access to information, through tracking down the truth. That said, we have basic biases in place. We have basic biases toward official sources. Again, I'm not talking about experts. I absolutely encourage constantly going to the experts. If you're talking about, say, the presidential office, I really hope that people, instead of consulting politicians, instead of talking to pundits, would actually go to presidential historians, political scientists who've spent their careers studying these issues. That's not what I'm talking about. And in order to demonstrate what I mean, I want to talk about this. The most deadly lynching in United States history that most people have never heard of. The Elaine massacre. The only reason that most people, if they do know about Elaine, it's pronounced Elaine because it's the South, is because of the Supreme Court case that followed. But the massacre itself is often, first of all, often called a race riot, which was common in those days. The main newspapers were almost entirely controlled by white people. All of their reporters were white people, white men, mostly. And often they were owned by business people, wealthy people who'd purchased the newspaper for one reason or another. And you see again and again and again exactly what happened in Elaine. In Elaine, a group of farmers that lived in this area of the Delta, the Black Belt, the corner of Arkansas that's right next to, across the border from Mississippi, were being cheated, horribly cheated, by white landowners, and were being kept in poverty unfairly. And they could get no redress from the justice system because who controlled the sheriff's office? The same oligarchy. Who controlled the courts? The same oligarchy. So they were investigating whether or not they should join a union. And the white people in the area were enraged by this, and this happened again and again and again. Every time that African American or Latino or Hispanic farmers or workers, sharecroppers decided that they wanted to band together to balance out the power, even when that was brought up, white people in whatever area that was, mostly in the South, would say, the black people are planning a genocide. They're planning a revolution. They're going to rise up and murder white people. And they would preemptively go in and murder all of these farmers, these poor farmers. And that's exactly what happened at Elaine. They were meeting inside a church. The sheriff showed up with a security guard from the railroad, and their driver, a black driver. We don't know how the shooting got started for sure, although we kind of do. But they fired dozens of bullets into the church. The black people fled. And of course, what ended up happening was a days-long massacre of every African American that was found. Not just found on the streets. They went into their homes, dragged them out, stole everything out of their homes, their furniture, any money they had saved, their tools, and murdered the people inside. The mayor of the city in the area asked for the Arkansas guard to come in, and eventually they did. They brought machine guns with them, Gatling guns, and there are reports of them installing the Gatling guns on top of buildings or in next to fields and just mowing down any African American that they saw. The reason I am mentioning this is because A, you've probably never heard of this, and there's a reason for that. From the moment it began, there was a concerted effort, and we actually have record of this, among all the people in power to control the narrative. So from the very first moment that African Americans began to die, the messages they were putting out was that this was an uprising, that the local people were helping out to quell this uprising, and that they were brave, law-abiding citizens risking their own lives to prevent violence. Now again, this happened so many times, it is dizzying. But when you go back now to try and find information about the Elaine race riot, which is what I'm doing for a book that I'm writing about my great-grandmother, it is nearly impossible to find any information about what happened. We don't even know how many African Americans were killed. One white reporter at the time said it was over 800. The white newspapers at the time reported it may have been 11 or 12, which is grossly a gross underestimation. We know it was much more than that. So I say this because if what you're relying on is newspaper accounts in order to tell the story of Elaine, you're just going to be repeating the lies and the intentional misinformation spread by those who are culpable for the deaths of these people. If all that you're doing is respecting authority and speaking to the governor, you're speaking to someone who is culpable in the deaths of hundreds of people. If you're speaking to the commander of the troops, you're speaking to someone who was responsible for the deaths of at least dozens of people. Black history was kept out of history books through exactly this method. By respecting authority, by accepting the police officers, the law enforcement story without question, by speaking to the government officials, which are almost entirely throughout history, white men. And then Ida B. Wells comes in, and we wouldn't have known anything about so many lynchings were it not for Ida B. Wells risking her whole life to go to these areas and do the reporting, the investigating that was needed in getting the real story. She actually wrote a short booklet on the Elaine race massacre, which I highly recommend. And I remember in a history class in college mentioning this about Ida B. Wells, and the teacher said, well, she was biased. You know, we have to take her writings with a grain of salt. She was trying to prove a point, which is insane. Every single white reporter writing about this was also biased and was also trying to prove a point. And in fact, we have reams of evidence showing they were deliberately spreading misinformation again and again and again. Lies, false claims. So we are doing this again. We are yet again going to the exact same people, normalizing them as though because somebody has a specific title, that somehow means we have to take what they say at face value. No, it doesn't. Just because somebody in power says something doesn't mean you have to quote it. You can go and find the actual expert. You can go and find your Ida B. Wells, the person who has done the work, who has been out there in the field investigating and getting the facts straight. And all of my colleagues in journalism, I encourage you to speak to the people that are there on the ground, that know the truth, and put them in your headlines. Thanks for listening. Have a good day and be kind.